My name is Roberto Garcia. I'm a clinical professor of international business here at the Kelley School of Business, and I'm in the management and entrepreneurship department.
And my understanding from reading your bio, sir, is that you have quite a bit of experience in the auto industry.
Yes, it's the major industry in which I conducted my dissertation research back in the 1990s in the global automotive industry. Yeah, so I've kept in touch with the industry and tend to follow the issues in the industry. And because I teach international business, I often look at the global auto industry in order to help my students understand what's going on in international business.
What is your initial reaction, I guess, to the foreign auto tariff that allegedly is going to go into place next week?
So my first reaction is that it's creating a lot of uncertainty. First of all, uncertainty for the original equipment manufacturers, uncertainty for all of their suppliers. And I think it's creating a lot of uncertainty for consumers who are waiting to enter the market to purchase a new automobile. So that's the first reaction. I think most everybody understands that with this uncertainty is going to come significant costs. And so I think everyone is sort of waiting and preparing for that. I think that something similar might happen as happened in 2021 with the semiconductor chip shortage. And so that's going to be an interesting way to kind of look at what's going to happen in the weeks and months ahead.
A 25% tariff, to me, just on the surface, that seems rather significant. Uh, is that a fair statement?
That's a huge tariff, and this is something that we have not seen in really since the 1930s, really since the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. So, yes, we are in new and uncharted territory with the size of these tariffs.
One of the things that I think is really peculiar and interesting in this debate, I guess, about a tariff on a foreign car is what is a foreign car? We have major plants in Indiana, for instance, that are assembly plants, but most of those parts for those cars are coming from overseas. And then a car that is Toyota, Honda, Subaru is being assembled in Indiana. So we're still talking about tariffs that are going to impact those kind of cars, but also if you're a Ford or a Chevy, a lot of those parts are coming from overseas. And are they going to be under this tariff as well? How does this shake out? And is that some of the confusion you were talking about?
Yes, that's some of the confusion, and also some of the costs are going to be added by the increase in bureaucracy and red tape in order to track, as you say, the coming and going of auto parts. See, what has happened is that since 1965, the US and Canada have been a pretty integrated market where, steel, aluminum, assembled cars, and auto parts can go back and forth under the US Canadian Trade Pact. In 1994, with the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico entered into the picture. So that provided an opportunity, particularly for the US Big Three, to consider, dividing up and playing a role with this integrated market to decide where to assemble some automobiles and where to source parts. And so for many years until recently, these companies did a pretty good job of trying to rationalize their production and reduce their cost by sourcing aluminum and steel and some parts from Canada, and then to engage in assembly in Mexico because of low cost production. And over time, also parts manufacturing also happened in Mexico. And so, the companies got pretty good and pretty efficient at deciding where to produce what between the three countries. So fast forward to today, we have a situation, as you say, when an American car, it might be, it might be a Chevy or it might be a Ford pickup truck, may be assembled in the US, but it might have engines and transmissions that come from Canada. And then it might have other auto parts that come from Mexico. And then some assembly also is being done in Mexico. So a pretty large portion of the cars that we consume here in the US may have been assembled in Mexico, for example. And so it's kind of understandable that some of these tariffs are targeting foreign companies, but it's pretty clear that the US producers and US manufacturing and US consumers are really going to be affected by these tariffs.
So this would have this I we have to assume at this point then that this kind of a tariff is going to pretty much affect the auto industry broadly and as a whole, correct?
Yes, the biggest impact is going to be borne by the the foreign manufacturers who don't have any production capacity in the US, in Canada, or in Mexico. So I think they're going to be the hardest hit. So a lot of the luxury makers, which represent a significant portion of our imports, something like 13% of the autos that are imported by the United States are coming, for example, from let's say Audi, Porsche, let's see, Land Rover, Alfa Romeo from Italy, Jaguar, and then there are some Lexus automobiles and some Genesis automobiles, the Japanese and the Koreans. So I think those are going to be the companies that are going to be first impacted because many of the luxury brands that we consumers in the US buy from those companies tend to be in the lower segments of the lower segment within the luxury segment. So when they get hit with the full brunt of the 25% tariff, that's going to be a major hit to their sales. And what's going to happen is when consumers experience a sticker shock, they're going to move away from those brands and they're going to look at, perhaps a US product, something that's assembled here in the United States or let's say in Canada and Mexico in the short term. But so they're going to be first hit, and then, but everybody, I think, is going to feel the pinch, and there's going to be a scramble for these companies to decide how they are going to be impacted and what they're going to do about it. Some models may be discontinued. Some production may be halted altogether for a time until companies can realize, what the full impact is going to be. And then some production may continue, but with some pretty major price increases. And by the way, suppliers are also going to be affected. It's likely that a domestic model, let's say a Ford or a Chevrolet or a Chrysler product, for example, might have halted production even though the automobile is assembled here because it's going to be waiting on parts that come from Canada and Mexico, and those parts are going to be severely hit with either the full brunt of the 25% tariff or a percentage of that. So it might not make sense why a certain model is put on hold or eliminated entirely or out of production, but it could be because of a few parts that are missing.
Roberto, the stated goal of this tariff would be to encourage the American auto industry to that cars are not only assembled here, but the parts and everything for that car are made in America. Do you see this kind of a tariff as moving toward that stated goal?
So first of all, I think we have to exercise a lot of caution because we have heard quite a bit about tariffs over the previous weeks and months, and there's been a pattern, right? First, the announcement is made, then the timeline is rolled out, And then sometimes the tariff is even implemented, but the next day the tariff is lifted, and then there are exceptions, right? Exceptions and exemptions. So with that caution, we don't know what's likely to happen, for example, on April 2nd, or if the tariffs go into effect on April 3rd, we don't know what's going to happen on April 4th. Right now, I think there's a scramble. A lot of the manufacturers are sending representatives to Washington, D.C., I think, to air their concerns and maybe get some kind of an exception or a halt. They're sharing information about all of the implications. But let's say that in the worst case scenario, all of these effects happen, right? Everything goes according to the projections and to the stated plan. In that case, um, what we know is that production is not going to shift overnight. Supply chains are not going to be realigned, or reshoring is not going to happen immediately. Manufacturing of this type takes years and years to realign and to sort out. So I think what's going to happen in the short term is there's going to be uh, production decreases. There's going to be shortages of certain models, and then there are going to be consumers that are going to move into the lower priced segments of the market, and even to used cars, right? Um, and so the price effects are going to go into effect in the near term, and then it's too soon to project how much production will actually shift back to the United States. I know that in many industries, many companies have said, we're never coming back. It does not make sense to come back from China or from this other country. We just cannot compete under these conditions with high labor costs and high infrastructure costs. It's just not going to happen. So another effect that is very likely is that some companies are going to drop some of their product segments. They're going to eliminate models altogether. And then some companies may just stop selling in the US, or may go out of business. So a lot could happen before the production just magically, goes from overseas back into or to the United States, which hasn't happened in a long, long time.
Roberto, you describe, I know it would take time, but a pretty devastating, perhaps dire situation in the auto industry.
That's correct. So the estimates right now are that for consumers, the prices of new cars, depending on the model and all of that, could rise from a low of $3,000 per vehicle for some models, up to as much as $12,500, depending on the model. That is very likely to happen. So we're going to see price increases. We do know that companies are putting their plans on hold, their long-term plans are on hold. So I think we're going to see production decreases. And then we're going to see drops in employment in the auto sector, both in the assembly of vehicles and also in the assembly of automobile parts. So I think that those are going to be pretty drastic and devastating effects. Now, there are different scenarios about who's going to pay for all of this. And right now, there are three major players who are going to be paying for the price increases. One is the original equipment manufacturers. So this is the Fords and the Stellantis and the General Motors, at least in the U.S. automakers. They're going to be working very hard with their dealers to try to hold the line on price increases. The original equipment manufacturers are not going to bear the total costs on their own. I know that the United Auto Workers would ask and almost require the U.S. government to obligate the original equipment manufacturers to bear all of the costs, but that's not likely to happen. They're going to put tremendous pressure on the dealers and also on the auto parts suppliers. And I think eventually what's going to happen is both the manufacturers and the dealers and the suppliers are going to pass the costs increasingly toward the consumer. And so that's the reality. So those are some of the devastating effects that we can expect in the short term. And that affects the state of Indiana, the state of Ohio, several of our neighbor states, that are producing automobiles, the state of Illinois, and then all the way down south to Kentucky, Alabama, South Carolina, where auto assembly takes place.
So this is purported to help the auto industry, but everything you're describing, Roberto, seems to hurt the auto industry.
Yes, there isn't. It's like we are in alternative realities because everything that I've ever learned about economic theory and what I've learned about the global auto industry long term, all of this paints a picture of more hurting of the industry and of employment and of consumers and the economy than helping, even in the best scenarios of the long-term picture. I see much more hurting than helping in the long term. And we can look back at history for this, right? We can go back to the time in the past when we have had tariffs of this scale and of this amount. Uh, and when was that? It was really between the two world wars. It was, as I said, during the stock market crash of 1929 and during the Great Depression. Here's another thing that doesn't make me feel optimistic. What happened back then is happening now in the sense that other countries whose exports are going to be impacted and whose employment are going to be impacted, whose employment is going to be impacted, those countries are not going to take it lying down. Right now, Mexico seems to be very cooperative with the Trump administration because they don't want to hurt their export sector, but they have a plan for retaliation. Canada is retaliating in a very strong way, and Europe is set to retaliate also in a very strong way. So what happened in the past is when those other economies were impacted, they retaliated. It's called tit for tat, right? So you inflict some level of economic pain on me. I'm going to do the same to you in the hopes that you will back down and you will change your policies. You will see the light and you will, either negotiate or just eliminate these practices. But what happens is some of these issues become personal and they fester. And then instead of cooler heads prevailing, the pressure gets ratcheted up, and then it could take a long time for these things to be sorted out. By the way, not many people know that the US industry right now, even before the 2018 tariffs, since 1963, we have been paying a 25% tariff on some work vehicles coming from Europe. It's called the chicken tax. It's a trade war that started when Europe imposed a 25% tariff on US chickens. So the US retaliated by using a 25% tariff. Now, this is 1963, okay? And so then over the years, the tariff on the chickens from Europe went away. The tariffs on other products from Europe, like wines and cheeses and those kinds of things, they went away. But the tariff that remained, called the chicken tax, is on US on vehicles that are automotive vehicles that are for the workplace, for in the work segment, and pickup trucks. And that's still in effect. Regardless of everything that's going on today, that 25% tariff has never gone away, and it's benefited the US auto industry with a little bit less competition from Europe. So the lesson here is if we're ready to engage in this type of war, we need to be ready that it could last 60 years or longer. Some of these tariffs, once the stakeholders who are proponents of these tariffs begin to benefit, then it's very hard for the government to take these away. And then consumers end up, paying for this for a long time.
Roberto, thank you very much for your insight. I think we'll conclude there unless there's anything else on this issue that we didn't touch on that you think is important to stress or that strikes you about this. And I don't know, maybe if there's, so many of these tariffs, as you alluded to earlier, have been more threats than reality. How convinced are you that this tariff is going to go into effect next week?
Well, I'm not optimistic. I'm pretty convinced, and the reason that I'm convinced that it will go into effect is there has been a certain amount of pressure that has been building related to the previous exemptions or the previous stops and starts. So I think that anytime this pressure begins to build, at some point, it is going to go into effect. I'm also concerned that some of the countries that might be impacted will lose patience in negotiating, and then they will just stop and they will wait, which will again increase the chances that the timeline and the plan will actually go into effect. So in terms of concluding comments, what I would say is we have to be really careful in these trade wars because they could be around, these tariffs and these restrictions could be around for a long, long time. They may be very difficult to take away. The other lesson from all of this, and I think we're seeing it now, is they are intended to help the US domestic auto industry, but there's a lot of information. It's not a mystery. It's not big news that it's going to impact the U.S. auto industry. It's going to hurt the auto industry negatively. So we have to understand that. And then the final caution here is that when countries engage in these kinds of trade wars, there's a scramble to figure out who's going to pay for it. In the end, the biggest costs are borne by consumers, and so we have to really be cautious on that end too. So those would be my concluding comments.